Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello. Welcome to Healing the Spirit. And I am currently in the midst of creating an offering. I think it's going to be self-paced. And yeah, it's basically about 2026. And in this offering, I share some downloads and transmissions that I've been receiving as I'm initiating this process of connecting with the spirit of 2026. And I wanted to come on here because I needed a break. I then started thinking about what are some of the lessons that I've been learning throughout 2025. Obviously, there's always this entire debate in this threshold of one Gregorian calendar year into another. But here's my take on it, which is that time is truly actually a spiral anyway. And these human divisions are really ways for us to make sense of our limited time on earth, right? We're not really speaking always to the spirit of time, like capital T time itself. But I do think that these measurements that we experience through our human bodies are absolutely real. So, anyways, all of that is to say that, yeah, I just kind of want to come on here and speak rather informally. Yeah, just kind of have a chat with all of you here about my own personal journey, which, it's funny because I'm sure that if you listen to this podcast regularly, you hear me talking about this on the regular. Like I sprinkle it through the things that I share on this podcast. I really see a lot of my work as very much being transmissions, transmissions of the things that I have been reflecting on, things that I'm contemplating, and also this greater field that essentially I'm always talking to, right? Like that's really what's at the core of my work. And, at the same time, I'm also a human being and I go through stuff, but I don't usually spend a lot of time putting that at the center of the banquet, so to speak. And if this is the first time you're listening to the podcast, maybe this is not the best episode to start because that's really what this episode is going to be. It's just me finding an excuse to come on here and talk with you, human to human, about things that I've been moving through. And this feels to me like maybe kind of the mirror to a few episodes that I recorded and released at the start of the year. They're cheekily titled How Not to Plan 2025. And in those episodes, I talk about how I plan the year. I've been playing with a lot of different kinds of planning, but to me, what actually works better is more this zoomed out, kind of more Jupiterian way of thinking about the coming year or whatever slice of time I'm working with, rather than having concrete plans, because part of my life and part of my own creative process is this kind of constant unfolding. I tend to find that once I lock something down or I write something on paper, usually within a few days, it starts to morph and shapeshift. So I find that being too rigid about things don't really help. That being said, I do find it really helpful to think about the things that I don't want to be doing, right? I'm currently taking this voice teacher training in this school called Vocally Armoring that's founded by my friend and, just someone I deeply, deeply admire, Marissa Michelson, who's been on a podcast a couple times. And something that we learned in that tradition in that school is that often it's more helpful to tell ourselves what not to do, right? That we can kind of use these guardrails in our life by remembering what to not do. So, for example, in the case of singing, to remember to not forget to breathe, which is a bit circular as I'm saying it. But Marissa would always say to us, don't forget to breathe, right? Which is more helpful, I find, because it kind of reminds us of these default ways of being that we tend to adopt without really thinking about it. And being kind of awakened from that default, I find to be a more helpful way to approach new chapters in my life rather than thinking about what I should do, right? Because then when I start thinking about what I should do, I get into this kind of wrestling with myself, wrestling with this idea. And sometimes that wrestling is just kind of a waste of energy, right? Whereas if I already know the things that I have identified to not be helpful for myself, then remembering that tends to be, yeah, just really helpful. This year has been a big year for me. It has been, to be honest with you, somewhat challenging in terms of my tarot card for the year. It was a tower year for me. In terms of the annual profection is a 12th house year. And this was also the snake year in the Chinese zodiac, which is significant because both of my destiny and my conception palace are snake, for those of you who are familiar with that modality. And it's also a 7 year for me in numerology. So it was bound to be obstacles galore. And in some ways, it has been. It's interesting because it's kind of giving me a different perspective of what obstacles even mean. Because when I look at it on paper, this has been a very successful year for me as well. But there was kind of a sense of emptiness, there was a sense of unrest, there was a sense like that things were not going right. It was very much like Princess of the Pea energy. Throughout the entire year, something wasn't sitting right with me. It was very difficult in music theory terms for me to find my tonic key, so to speak, right? It was very challenging to find my home key and to feel like I'm in the flow. There was a lot of questioning that happened this year. There were a lot of introspection. And there were also a lot of starts and stops. I actually was just going through some of my notes for the podcast because before I come on, usually I try to write a few words and kind of structure what it is I'm going to say. I was kind of surprised because there were many, many months where I started a very extensive set of notes on certain episodes I want to do that never got published. And then this morning, I opened up my Canva and I saw the same pattern. There were a lot of posts that I was going to share on Instagram that ultimately never really got posted for one reason or another. So, in any case, that's kind of the overall vibe of what I've been moving through. Some of them felt like doubts. Some others kind of felt like these were seeds that I was planting, and it didn't feel right to share them because they weren't ready. Yeah, on the one hand, there was that. And then towards the end of the year, there were a lot of kind of rude awakenings for me. There were a lot of moments of recognizing old patterns that have been running my life that have infiltrated and woven itself into how I run my work. And that's been a somewhat challenging realization. It's like the judgment card. It's like looking at all these patterns that you've been operating within and finally really stepping out of it. I think you can even hear this. I don't remember exactly which month it was, but there was an episode that I created, one of the monthly episodes. It was a solo episode and it was titled Game On. And I remember feeling like the energy was very different there. It was as if I like broke out of a specific shell that I've been in. And since then, a lot of things have been integrating. Like I'm no longer in that kind of really strong, like steely energy, maybe. But there were a lot of those moments of kind of like realizing what I've been doing, getting myself out of that pattern, and then as time elapsed, really letting that integrate into a new state of being. I feel like I'm someone who is usually pretty confident about getting up there, sharing my thoughts, my perspectives, things I'm learning, which is something I really love about myself. I love not feeling like I have to have it all figured out, not feeling like I need to be this perfect beacon and embodiment of the thing I'm about to share before I share it. I like to actually share from the place of being in process with the thing. And this year, a lot of that has kind of been taken away from me. It kind of feels really vulnerable to do that. And when I try my best to just kind of get over that fear, it just didn't feel right. And hence, all the drafts and the unpublished notes that I was mentioning earlier. And I would say what has been really positive is I've been really taking my own medicine and cultivating inner sight in moments where things feel kind of confusing and dark. And I don't mean dark in like a sinister way. I just mean like literally I couldn't see anything, right? When I'm literally walking in a darker alleyway, it's been actually helpful for me to adjust to that lower level of illumination and then moving at the pace that is correct, which is a lot slower than what I tend to prefer. I tend to prefer to move at a million miles per hour and then just get things done, right? This year has been a lot of me integrating the tools and the perspectives, the wisdom that I've been accumulating, for lack of a better word, in the past few years, and then really applying them, but in a way that was kind of unexpected. Again, I was being invited to use my tools and remember these perspectives in the face of not a lot of clarity around who I am, what I'm here to do. And I think that actually has increased my capacity to be with challenging stuff, both in my own life and also in the lives of my clients and students. And this is reminding me of a container I had run a few years ago. I think I stopped offering this container at the start of 2025. And the container was called, it's a mentorship one on one container. It was called Night Vision. And there were a few clients, you know who you are, who went through this. And essentially, what that container was we would meet weekly, an hour each week. And so it was a very intensive container for 6 months. And essentially, this is a space where I get to really play the role of someone's guide and facilitator, but mostly kind of spiritual companion as this person is moving through the depths of whatever it is they're moving through. And this container was extremely challenging to facilitate, actually, because the nature of the energy and the intention that wove itself into the container was such that it was kind of a trust fall. It was a trust fall for both me and the clients who were doing it, because there was a certain level of nervous system level safety that we created both individually and relationally within that container at the start, that then allowed for this opening to happen, and growth. I'm actually currently in the middle of my own Jupiter return. So this idea of growth and expansion is really alive for me. And something I'm reminded of as I'm moving through the cycle of my Jupiter return is that growth is a lot of the times kind of gross. Like there's something about growth that is painful. Think about when you were a teenager. Growth can be embarrassing, growth can feel really awkward, and growth can cause a lot of distortions that just weren't there before. And this was something I was kind of witnessing and that I was with in terms of the journeys that my clients were on when I was offering that container. And then I shifted my mentorship container into something that was just as deep, but not as intense, that there was more space to breathe and to kind of dance within the container rather than just kind of being so in lockstep with one another. And what was funny was as I created more space for my client work, I then had to hold that space for myself. So, all in all, that's kind of me saying that this year has been lesson after lesson around expanding my own capacity to be with the frustration that comes with my own growth. I lost my job in October. It was a career path that I've been on for the past 10 years. And it wasn't a career move that I made lightly. As some of you may know, I studied music. I really wanted to be a musician when I was a teenager. That was the path I wanted to be on. And at some point in my 20s, I had a lot of fear and anxiety around whether I could even provide for myself being a musician. I was at a very dark moment in my journey, and I didn't have any confidence whatsoever in my identity or skill as a musician. So I made this pivot into the insurance industry. I studied math and then I studied economics. And then I was on this path as an actuary. Basically, actuaries calculate the risks for insurance companies. And that was the career path I was on. I was lucky to work with people that I really respected. I really enjoyed working with them. They were very nice. Um, there were a lot of things about the company I was working for, the environment I was in, their business philosophy that increasingly became more and more misaligned for me as I grew older, as I went through my Saturn return, as I grew up, essentially. It became more challenging for me to stay in that role from a place of being sincerely invested in my own growth as an actuary, which is a really difficult place to be. But at the same time, it was a significant portion of my income. And so I was on that path and very grateful for all the lessons I learned and all the people I met, all the skills I built being in that environment. And in October, the organization went through a restructure and I was let go. And that was a big one for me. I also was straying away from the astrological path. This, if again, if you have been listening for a long time, first of all, thank you. And second of all, you may have noticed that in 2025, I was playing around more with my the energy practitioner, the energy worker side of me. I was doing more channeled transmissions. I was speaking more about spiritual concepts and lessons from the spiritual path that I feel everybody should know or at least be exposed to. I was sharing more from that place because I really wanted to cultivate my own ability to be with challenges that present themselves on the spiritual path. To me, astrology, from a technical point of view, is very interesting and very exciting. However, at the heart of my work and the point of doing astrology at all for me has always been to befriend the mystery, because I believe that befriending the mystery and getting more uncomfortable with the unknown nature of life at any given moment, the ever changing nature of reality, is the point of doing astrology. You know, I wasn't interested in using astrology to try to control reality. I wasn't interested in using astrology to control myself or anyone or anything, really. And historically, a lot of people use astrology in that way. And I think that can be a really solid, valid way to use the craft. You know, there's certainly a lot of history around that usage of astrology, but that just wasn't what I was drawn to. So I really wanted to see what I would learn about the spiritual path if I remove the astrological lens from it. And then also I've been experiencing progressively throughout this year getting very solidly grounded in my body for the first time. It's not like I was not embodied before, but there was, and I think this is really common on the path of deconditioning. There was kind of this resistance, that there was this space that I was creating between my soul self, my spirit self, my intuition, my heart, and my body. And who I am in terms of this flesh and bones, right? And blood and skin that I'm in this lifetime. There is a lot of ancestral wisdom that I was turning away from, because that ancestral wisdom also came with a lot of ancestral pain. Like I mentioned earlier, I think I just didn't quite have the capacity, or maybe more accurately, I've been expanding my capacity for being with these more difficult things. And finally, I feel like this year I've been learning what it actually means to have faith, which is so interesting for me and almost comedic, because I did grow up very religious, and there was a very specific idea that was sold to me about what it means to have faith. There was a very clear definition of what faith needs to look like. And this year has been a year where I clear the cache, right? You know, clear all the files in the memory bank about that, and to really deepen into a felt, embodied, inspirited idea of what it means to have faith for myself, what that actually looks like. Here are some of the summarized lessons that I learned as I am pouring gasoline on the matches that I lit in 2025, so to speak. Okay, the first lesson I learned in 2025 was to stop obsessing over being organized or planning meticulously. When it comes to cultivating faith and walking by faith on our spiritual path, what I'm learning is that sometimes planning meticulously hides an underlying dynamic. Planning meticulously is often a kind of overcompensation for something that you really did not want to see. There's something in your reality, whether internal or external, that's really hard to be with. And planning can really obscure your ability to see it. Planning creates a certain distance between you and the present moment reality. When you stop planning so obsessively and meticulously, you start to see what the discomfort is about, why that discomfort was there, and yeah, that there's an opportunity for you to interact with this discomfort, to be in conversation with this discomfort. And this is very similar to, hmm, before I go there, let me just say, I kind of want to tie this back to my point earlier about how we use astrology, because a lot of how we use astrology in the astrological industrial complex is on a very subtle way selling certainty, right? If we can read the patterns on the planets, then we can prepare ourselves. And I think that's true. But I also think that in order to truly prepare ourselves in a way that gets us closer to reality, rather than consistently perpetuating this orientation to life where you're basically just kind of reinforcing your own matrix, right? Which is a very unsatisfying place to be. Because I think many of us, what we truly want is to deepen into a kind of intimacy with being alive. That's actually what we crave. We crave an expanded capacity to be with whatever comes our way, more so than preventing bad things from happening, right? And so, to me, when we stop obsessing over how to prepare for the swath of time that is lying ahead of us, we start to see, hey, there's something here for me to address. There's a way of looking at life that I've been operating from that has been keeping me safe, but is also putting a cap, putting a ceiling on the level of satisfaction or peace or success or surprise that I can experience in life. I also see a fractal of this in terms of the constant need to work on my projects, the constant need to work on my business, and to continue to improve. Because this desire to refine and to improve, I think is really beautiful. I mean, look, I'm a Virgo rising, right? So just given that information, you should know that it is very natural for me to plan meticulously or to be in this hamster wheel of constant improvement. I think that's really exciting. But this year, what I'm learning is when I stop doing that, I realized there is something about my orientation to that was kind of needing a remodel. And specifically, when I stopped trying at some point, maybe like halfway through the year, I stopped trying to improve my website or my podcast or my Instagram. What I started to see was I've been trying to hide from a fear of letting people know that my practice matters to me. There's this fear of selling, there's this fear of being in both energetic and financial exchange with people that has been disguising itself as obsessing around how to improve my work life. And I also see that in terms of my investing journey. There is some money that I have that is set aside that I can invest in, and I notice myself very anxious about how to be the best investor. And I realize when I clear away this anxiety about optimizing myself as an investor, what I start to see is I was scared to have that money. So all of these fears and all of these resistances start to show up when I stop doing things. There's a fear of taking charge over my life that's been disguising itself as this compulsion to try to make things super tight, make things really polished, make things work really well. So that's the first lesson I learned. The second lesson is that what's really meant for you is not going anywhere. And this is something I am experiencing recently, maybe in the past month or so, that there's been this renaissance within myself, this hunger, this desire to return to astrology in my practice, to really kind of put astrology back in the center of what I do, and even just to introduce myself as a mystical astrologer. And I thought that was so interesting because there's certainly been moments throughout 2025 where I thought I was going to leave astrology behind completely. And I think this makes a lot of sense because prior to that, from 2022 to the end of 2024, I had been, pedal, what do people call that? Pedal to the metal when it comes to astrology. I was taking all the astrology courses. I was really putting a lot of pressure on myself to become the best astrologer I could be. And I'm very grateful for that past version of me because it really taught me a lot of lessons that are deeply valuable. And it helped me cultivate skills as an astrologer that I can now rely on. I can use these skills to serve myself, to serve my clients, to help my students. And this year, it kind of felt like something else was wanting to come through. And I had to step away from astrology a little bit. I offered a slew of readings that I called Creative Spirit Reading, which was a smashing success, much to my bewilderment, because I had thought that everybody knew me as an astrologer. That if I started offering something that's not explicitly astrology, that people just wouldn't buy, especially if I kept my current rate. And I was completely surprised because that was not the case. The Creative Spirit readings basically sold out super quickly. And then I also followed this impulse to deepen into doing deep dive mentorships with people. This year, I really let myself claim the identity of a mentor, which to me, a mentor is someone who is not exactly like a teacher. A teacher is usually standing behind a certain lineage or a certain methodology and is teaching you exactly how to relate to that methodology, which I also do play the role of a teacher. But this year, it felt important to be more of a mentor, which to me is someone who is working closely with someone in their own process. The role of a mentor or a guide is to cultivate the ability to see someone clearly and to help encourage people to make the adjustments that will help them become more of themselves. To me, that's what a mentorship is, as opposed to me telling you what to do, me giving you certain methods, right? And the result is in, because we're at the end of the year now, I would say from a business perspective, it was surprising again because it was a move that resulted in business growth. But I also really miss astrology. And I think when I look back at the start of this year, a few things was happening in my relationship to astrology. One, I think there was kind of a saturation point in the astrology market in general. We had been, since 2020, I think a lot of people started getting into astrology and that market became so saturated. There are so many astrologers. Everybody is an astrologer now, right? If I were to be honest with you, to my ego, it was somewhat offensive to the part of me that wanted to be original because I got into astrology because it was kind of this weird niche thing. And it has stopped becoming that. So I think I was kind of losing my desire to continue walking that path because I'm seeing so many people doing it. That's maybe more spoken from the perspective of how I interact with the larger ecosystem. But if I get closer with myself and I observe my own internal process, I think what's happening is actually I was needing a little bit of space from astrology because where I'm going, and I know this because I've been feeling this for months now, and I think as 2026 is getting closer, I'm really seeing how true this is. That where I'm going is really claiming a way of practicing astrology that is truly unique to myself and my gifts and who I am as a person and how my energy wants to move. And this is actually a really massive undertaking. This is something that a lot of my mentees come to me with, essentially saying, hey, I'm really curious about astrology, but somehow the way that all these other people are talking about astrology is just kind of not exciting to me or doesn't feel totally real and totally true to me. What do I do? Right. And often on that path, we are asked not just to continue building our technical skills as an astrologer, but to really get to know ourselves. And sometimes that does require us to step away from the craft a little bit, right? Or to kind of let it be in the background so that we can develop these other parts of self, these other skills. I think it's so valuable. I don't think a lot of people have talked about this. And this is something I'm going to essentially talk more about because if you are someone who is very multidimensional, chances are when you start stepping into a certain modality like astrology, you are going to bring in all these other dimensions that make you who you are. And the path to getting there can be very challenging. And I know all about that because I've been moving through that myself. So, yeah, what I do know at the end of 2025 is I literally cannot bring myself to do normal kind of straight up astrology readings anymore. Not that that was ever what I was doing, but in my mind, I was kind of orienting to how do I give an astrology reading DM, right? Like, how do I give like a legit astrology reading that will be approved of by my teachers or by people I respect in the astrology community? And I know that I can't bring myself to do that anymore. And I know that next year, astrology is really going to return to being the center of my work in a completely new way. There was this conversation that I recorded with Kelsey Rose Tortorici titled The Frequency Dojo. And I think we talk a lot about this. We talk about this experience of locking into a sense of deeply honoring and knowing intimately who you are as a person, as a frequency, as an energy being, and then orienting your skills, everything that you've built up until this point, from that lens. right? And I'm kind of seeing this too with my musician self, that my musician self is really coming back, and not in the way that it's interesting, because when these parts of self that was once really, really important to us, these aspects of self are coming back, what I'm seeing is that I am becoming less interested in doing it right. I'm becoming less interested in doing it according to the standards that were set for me in the beginning. And I think those standards are important, right? Because when we're first starting out, we do need some guardrails about what to do, what not to do. But I think part of walking the devotee path is that you'll eventually find your own way of doing it. Like, you kind of have to be a rebel in order to be a really devoted person. Okay, moving on. The third lesson that I learned this year was you always know that something will happen. You will not know when or how something is going to happen. This is especially true if you've been honing your intuitive capacity, your psychic skills, your oracular nature for a while. You just know that something's going to happen. You have this hunch, and I think the hunch is available to everyone. You don't have to be someone who identify yourself as an intuitive to have a hunch, right? As long as you're someone who is willing to be honest with yourself, which can be tough, can sometimes require the help of another person who's been on the path to cultivate. You do know things. You do know when something is temporary. You do know when a relationship is misaligned or a job isn't truly satisfying to you. And you know that there's an expiration date to this. But what I learned this year is, boy, oh boy, you will not see things coming your way, like at all. Even if you have trained yourself and you have a track record of helping other people professionally, you will not know for yourself. And I think this is actually a really good thing, because when you're on the spiritual path, there is a part of your soul contract that is about surrender. And surrender is the antithesis to knowing everything well in advance, right? And again, I think this kind of ties back to what I was saying earlier about preparation, because there's a way to prepare that is more about releasing your attachment to how things need to go a certain way, that I think can actually be more helpful than preparing in a way that's like, oh, I'm going to get all the resources that I need in order to prepare for that eventuality, right? There's a way in which you can orient to preparation more from a place of surrender, more from a place of letting go of your own attachment to specific outcomes, that can actually be really helpful for when the rug is finally pulled from underneath you. I really thought that I was going to have a choice about when and how to leave my job and the career path that I was on. I had been on this multi-year journey of cultivating my both internal and external ability to be an entrepreneur, which really is a fancy way of saying doing what I want in the way that I want, with the people I want to do it with, and then maintaining my three-dimensional survival in this reality, right? That's all it means to be an entrepreneur. Being an entrepreneur is not it's not some fancy thing that you have to aspire towards. It's really not, right? It's not even that sexy at all. I think that word gets thrown around a lot, and we see these tech billionaires, that we put on a pedestal, right, as a culture. But I think that being an entrepreneur is a lot less it's a lot more foundational and fundamental than that, right? It's basically just someone who is following their own path and figuring out how to navigate the existing systems without sacrificing what truly matters to them. That's all it means to be an entrepreneur in my dictionary. And when my day job was taken away from me, I was shook. I also knew on some higher level that it was the perfect timing, but it shook me. And there's something here, I think, about how when you're beginning to really be in your own energy, you just know stuff. Not because you're this crazy oracle, right? But because you know yourself and you recognize on some level that reality is a mirror of who you are and who you choose to be. So when you choose the path of what is feeling resonant and what is drawing you to it, the things that are not in resonance, that are not in harmony with what matters to you anymore, is just going to start falling off. But at the same time, you're not going to be in control with how it falls off. And so, if you are finding yourself in that space and you're listening to this, I would really highly encourage you not to go crazy about it, right? Just be with what is unfolding, which can look like not a lot at all. For me, for many, many years, I knew that that career path is expiring for me, but I was inside the jar, right? I couldn't see the label. I didn't know when the expiration date was. And so your job is simply to remember that the nature of reality is constant change and that when the time comes, you are going to become the steward of that change. You are going to encourage, you are going to nourish yourself in the direction of that change rather than continuing to perpetuate the known. The fourth thing that I learned, and I think this is the last one that I'm going to share today, is finding your own standards is really the key to peace. At the end of last year, in 2024, I was traveling in Tokyo and I went to this coffee shop and there was this really beautiful mug that has this slogan on it. It says, "Find your own standards." And I just knew I wanted that mug because this is my new motto. I was at the height of being unhappy with a lot of how I've been orienting internally to my work, and by extension, what is showing up in my reality, right? As a result of that internal orientation. I really needed a remodel internally of how I orient to working, what it even means to work, and how to work, how to show up as someone who genuinely, most of the time, really enjoy working, but has had, these inherited conditionings about how to work that isn't really serving me. There have been so many moments recently, especially, where it's like if I were to use someone else's standards, if I were to look at my life from the perspective of someone else, I would be like, boy, you are fucked, right? Like, you are a complete failure. Like, if I see myself through a movie screen, or I imagine 20 something year old me looking at what's currently happening, they would be like, you need to get panicked right now. You need to be appalled, right? I've done launches this year with very few signups. I've made creative and business moves that, at least seen from the short term, totally did not pan out, right? When I look at it from the bigger perspective, everything did work out, right? So there was this paradox of, as I expand my capacity for having more of a bigger picture success that is actually life giving to me, that actually feels really good to my system, there were smaller moves, smaller strategic moves that I was making that actually was looking very horrible. And I see this too. Whenever I start, losing my own standards, losing my own perspectives, whenever I'm in a space of, usually for me, this happens when I am not aware of how my energy is running. This usually happens when I'm tired and I didn't know it. This usually happens when there's something that I don't like about how I'm relating to other people or how other people are relating to me, that somehow I'm still perpetuating. I'm still letting it happen. When I'm kind of in that space, I lose sight of who I am. I lose sight of what matters to me. And then I start looking at the things that seem to not be working in my life and I start judging it by some external measure. And that's when usually I start spiraling downwards, right? It's so interesting because at the end of the year here, I have seen this happening enough times during my tower year that I got really good at noticing when that happens and then shifting back into who I am now and what I know to be true about myself and to be true about reality. And then when I see it from that perspective, it was almost like this 180-degree turn of recognizing, like, wow, I am really living my dream life. When I let myself operate from the knowing of my higher self, from the knowing of my eternal child, from the knowing of my wise ancient self, I know that everything, all is more than well. This is actually going so according to plan. Hella fucking Luya. And the gap, my friends, is scary, right? The gap of me judging my life or what is happening from the perspective of some marketing bro that I saw on YouTube that I didn't even know, or from the perspective of these people that I've put on a pedestal in my childhood as authority figures, right? There are two antidotes I found to be extremely helpful when it comes to finding and then living according to your own standards. One is recognizing that you can do that, which entails cultivating a deep relationship with your higher self, with your wise self, with your eternal now moment self, and trusting that you can actually live life from that perspective. And then on the other hand, too, I think on a relational level, recognizing where you are putting people unconsciously on a pedestal. And this, this is something I notice in my client work actually. And when I notice this because I have a contrasting relationship to this, where my own pattern is I unconsciously worship or kind of glorify someone as an all-knowing teacher, only then to realize that no, they are not. They're only speaking from their perspective, and I get to liberate them from having to play the role of this all-knowing, always wise teacher in my own reality. I can recognize that what they're saying has resonance and has wisdom for me without needing to put them in this cage of always being right. Right? I can filter what they're saying and being like, okay, I can see instances where that can be useful for me. I don't have to always agree with them, right? But I also see this from the other perspective with my clients. I have a lot of clients who it's much harder to recognize the pedestal pattern when you're on this other side, which is some part of their ego is not even wanting to see that they're putting this person on a pedestal. They're almost seeing this person as a villain, as a way to validate their own perspective, right? That they're not at a place yet where they're fully secure and fully comfortable with their own perspective and how they want to embody their own perspective on their own path. And so they then see this person as an adversary, right? They see this online guru as an adversary. They kind of hate on that person. And it's not like I don't know this pattern. I definitely do that in my life too, but I'm just saying that when my clients come to me and share this with me, it's so much easier for me to see that that's also a way that we put people on a pedestal, right? We put people on a pedestal when we treat them as an enemy, when we treat them as the embodiment of everything we're against. That's actually a kind of twisted pedestal. Okay, so going back to what I learned about finding our own standards as the key to peace, what I find is when you truly let yourself find your own standards, embody your own standards, you then step into this state where you're almost like drenched in perpetual grace, where you're surrounded by grace. I'm remembering, in the Akashic invocation that I was using a lot a few years ago when I had a very devoted Akashic practice, there was this line: surround us with endless peace and grace, or something like that. That I feel is actually what begins to happen when you allow yourself to see your life and to interpret the things unfolding in your reality from the perspective of your higher self, who is ultimately only interested in constantly learning and constantly having a deeper, more intimate relationship with life. That you are always in a state of grace. That state of grace is always accessible to you. This is not me boasting or trying to pose as some role model shit, right? This is actually, it feels crazy when you finally can lock into that perspective. Because when you lock into that perspective, everything is available to you and nothing is demanded of you. I was reading this book by Dan Millman, I believe. It's a numerology book. I forgot the exact title of the book, but if you just Google Dan Millman numerology, you'll find this book. And he was talking about how when you are walking on the path of the 7 year, you're being asked to cultivate gratitude. And I remember reading this and thinking, interesting. What does that mean? And I think at the end of 2025, I'm realizing how true that has been for me. That throughout this year, when I shift into gratitude, I see so much of what I've been given and places where I can increase my skill in terms of being a steward rather than being stuck in this pushing, forcing, surviving loop. Yeah, I think that feels complete. I think this is all I'm going to share with you today. And I'm really curious to hear what you think. I'm really curious to hear if you have been learning some of these lessons as well. And yeah, if you've been, if you have any questions, I would like to receive them. And I'll probably even record an episode about it. If you listen to this on Spotify, you can always leave it as a comment. If you can reach me on social media, just send me your question and I'll take it into consideration for future episodes. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts, I would really love if you can leave a review, even just 1 or 2 sentences. I love you all so dearly. Thank you for being here with me. Even though we are connecting asynchronously, your presence is not only deeply felt, but truly appreciated. So thank you so much. I will see you again very soon in another now moment. All right. Love you all. Take care.